So let's talk about Trump and Netanyahu, because I saw you posted about this on Twitter. Actually, Trump and Netanyahu, it was when Netanyahu was in the US. That's when they met. They really did have a very good working relationship. But you mentioned that this was a long time ago, right? At that time, Netanyahu was an up-and-coming figure in politics. He was a political star. So the Jewish community in the US introduced him to others. Why was Trump considered a political rising star back then?
In actual fact, he originally started out his career by doing professional PR and publicity work for the State of Israel. During his early formative years, he first studied diligently at Yale University and later continued his education at MIT, where he eventually decided to major in the field of architecture. This person's early life ambition was not to become a politician. He wanted to be an architect, which is why he studied at MIT. He originally studied the field of architecture as an undergraduate student, and then, of course, actually, I vividly remember when I did a show with you, or maybe it was with someone else, I talked about this before. He served his time in the Israeli Defense Forces for a while. It was quite a significant period in his early life. He was the elite of the elite, a machine gunner in the General Staff Reconnaissance Unit. He was outstanding. At the time, they even told him they wanted to train him to become the commander of the General Staff Reconnaissance Unit. If he became the commander of the General Staff Reconnaissance Unit, thank you, the president, the commander of the policy unit. This means that they were grooming him, giving him this opportunity. This was essentially a fast track for cultivating him to become a national leader, because before, as commanders of the presidential policy unit, there were people like Sharon and Barak, which makes this very clear. That is to say, after serving a few years as the commander of the presidential policy unit, he would then be placed in other branches of the military, such as the armored corps or paratroopers, to serve a few years as a brigade commander or division commander. Then following this path, he could rise to become a regional commander. And then essentially he could become the Minister of Defense or the Chief of General Staff. After that, he could leave the military and run for prime minister. Of course, he refused. After he refused, he recommended his brother to the general political department. And he said, "I want to come, but my brother is very capable. You can let my brother come." So later, his brother Yuning's Taijiahu became the commander of the general political department. Why did he refuse himself? Because at that time, his life goal was not to be a politician or a general. He wanted to be an architect, so after the war ended, he went to America. He continued studying architecture at MIT. Later, when he recalled this, he said that one day, while he was often on the lawn of the MIT campus, he saw a Jewish student, an Israeli student. There was a signboard set up over there, and someone was explaining the Middle East issue and clarifying Israel's position. He chatted with that person for a bit, and then that person told him at the time, anti-Israel propaganda in the United States is very serious, and so is anti-Israel propaganda in the West. If we don't speak up for ourselves, then no one will understand this issue. He was moved by that. So later on, while he was studying, he also started appearing on various American media outlets. So in the 1970s, he was in America, and he was a star political commentator in the media. Even now, you can still find a lot of this. Back then, he participated in these commentary programs on American television, speaking on behalf of Israel. You can already see from those clips of him speaking at the time, are you saying that
Was his English actually significantly more fluent than his Hebrew?
His English was better than his Hebrew, because you could say I happened to witness the entire 30 years of Israel's rise. I lived in Israel for 30 years, and I was always at the university. In the university, everyone was against Netanyahu. To tell you the truth, I didn't dare talk about Netanyahu with my friends in Israel. Whenever they mentioned Netanyahu, they were filled with hatred. They wanted to hear my opinion, so I didn't dare bring up the topic. One of the reasons they criticized Netanyahu from the very beginning was that his Hebrew wasn't good. They would say he can't even speak proper Hebrew, yet he comes to Israel to be prime minister. A professor I'm very close to once told me, I think Netanyahu's Hebrew vocabulary is only about 500 words. He just goes back and forth using those 500 words. So many people in Israel's elite circles look down on Netanyahu.
Why is his English so good? Was he born in the United States, or did he spend a long time in the US?
His mother is American. His mother is an American Jew. And then his secondary school, I forget whether it was middle school or high school. Maybe it started from middle school. He and his brother both studied in the US. Then he graduated from high school in the US, and then for his undergraduate studies, he did his undergraduate studies in the US, and his master's degree was also in the US. He is someone who is also very self-aware, and then for his undergraduate studies, when he graduated, his grades were excellent, truly outstanding. To what extent? When he was studying at MIT, he went to find At that time, there was a Jewish professor in charge at MIT, and he told him, in Israel, because I was in the General Staff Corps, even though I had already retired, I still had a reserve duty code. He said, "Given the situation in Israel, do I need to go back to Israel to fight? So my time is very tight, and your current standard course schedule at MIT," he said, "for me, actually, it's too slow." So what he requested was to be allowed to take double the course load, double the courses, to take double the courses. So while others might take 5 courses a year, he wanted to take 10 courses. He hoped the university would approve it. Later, Professor Utai, after understanding the situation in Israel, he advocated for him. Eventually, it was approved. After the approval, he studied at twice the pace of others. Moreover, his grades in every course were all outstanding. Wow, he was truly remarkable. In other words, he was exceptionally outstanding. But actually, I think he was even more remarkable than others. What was it? When he graduated with his bachelor's degree, he realized that it was impossible for him to become a great architect. He could do architectural design, but he said, "I lack the true artistic genius required to become a truly great architect." So he gave up. You see, in this regard, he simply gave up. He said, then I can't waste any more time on this. He didn't want to spend his whole life as just an ordinary architect, just working alone, so that's what he said. He still majored in architecture, but he chose most of his courses in other areas. In management, like management studies.
A wide range of academic studies.
Yes, in management. So after he graduated, after graduation, he worked in the United States for 2 years. He worked at a political consulting firm in the US. Oh.
Then why exactly did they want to do that? Please, go ahead, keep going.
Meanwhile, he was becoming more and more well-known in the US. In other words, he became a spokesperson for Israel in the United States. So when he demonstrated this kind of talent, he was highly valued by the American Jewish community. So at that time, the American Jewish community began to cultivate him. First of all, it was the emergence of such a famous Jewish figure. He came from Israel, and first and foremost, it was the American Jewish community itself. These leaders began to meet and interact with him, and after these meetings and interactions, they started to feel that this person truly had talent. So this is what happened. They started introducing him to famous figures from various political and business circles in the United States. And in this regard, you can see that it's really impressive. In the 1980s, if you think about it, Trump back then wasn't really anybody yet, just a young star in the business world. You couldn't see any political future for him or anything like that. But he felt that at that time, at Jehu's age, at that age, he should be introduced to those national leaders and citizens. He was also considered a future star of America, wasn't he? At that time, the American political scene was controlled in a way similar to Taiwan's. People from that same era would go on to dominate the world, a whole group like that. So he got to know many of America's so-called young financial elites at the time. All of this was arranged for him by the Jewish community in America back then. So Trump was one of them. Yes, Trump was one of them. And then you see there was this politician in Israel. He once wrote a memoir recalling that it was around 1982 during the Lebanon War. At that time, he said there was one time he took a train from New York to Washington. He didn't know what it was for. On the train, he ran into that guy, so he started chatting with him. At the time, that guy was still a young man. He asked him that day, he asked me, "How do you see yourself in 10 years? Who do you think you'll be in 10 years? That young man replied, "In 10 years, I will be the Prime Minister of Israel. In 10 years, I will be the Prime Minister of Israel." But his prediction was a bit early. From 1982 to 1992, he still wasn't the Prime Minister of Israel. But by 1996, he really did become one, Prime Minister of Israel.
Wow, these kinds of people, they all seem to have a sense of their own future in their minds. Because just a couple of days ago, I happened to see Trump back in the year 2000. 26 years ago, he was at a Cuban gathering, a Cuban community event. At that time, he supported those Cubans who had fled to the United States. Then he said, "I will witness your victory." He said, "When I see your victory, I will be here to witness it. When I witness your victory, by that time, I will either be the most famous developer or I will be the greatest president."
This is indeed remarkably similar to the foundational concept of prophets found within both the Jewish tradition and the broader biblical tradition. In this context, the true meaning and role of a prophet is the unique ability to perceive and understand that many significant things, which most ordinary people might think are very distant or even impossible to foresee, are actually much closer and more relevant than they appear. To him, seem very close. This is what makes a prophet. The biggest difference from others is this difference in the concept of time. For us, it may seem that, for example, something might only happen in 100 years or 50 or 60 years from now. I also don't know when these things will actually happen, and we can't clearly see what things will look like when they do happen. But people who have this prophetic ability, they feel that these things are right within reach. They feel these things are right before their eyes. So people like this often have a kind of forward-looking awareness at times. Isn't Tianxia a very typical example of this kind of person, for example, as we just mentioned? He said, in 10 years, I want to become the Prime Minister of Israel. At that time, no one believed it. As we later discussed, when we look back at the Israeli political spectrum, there was originally no hope at all. But he had this kind of foresight, he had this kind of vision. He felt, I can see myself becoming the Prime Minister of Israel one day, and when I look at that day, I feel it's very close. Another example is the issue of attacking Iran, which was in 2006. There was a consensus in Israel that the Iran issue needed to be resolved, but through a large-scale air war and direct confrontation with Iran, to destroy Iran's military strength and eliminate Iran's ability to threaten Israel. Eliminating this was Netanyahu's original intention. Netanyahu foresaw this, and in 2009, he really began to prepare to attack Iran. After winning that election, he brought in Barak, who was the most capable general in the Israeli military at the time and was then the leader of the Labour Party. He was his opposition. He brought him over and invited him to join his own government. He made him Minister of Defense. The reason Barak agreed to become Minister of Defense for him, it was because Netanyahu made it clear to him, as Minister of Defense, you have only one job, to strike Iran. So they really were preparing to attack Iran. At that time, Israelis thought he was crazy, and so did the Americans. Obama tried to stop Netanyahu from attacking Iran. He specifically invited Barak to Washington and said that he couldn't stop Netanyahu, but he managed to stop Barak. Barak, later, after talking with Netanyahu and Obama, he changed his stance. All the generals in the entire Israeli military opposed Netanyahu. In the end, Netanyahu abandoned the plan to attack Iran in 2009. In fact, looking back now, if they had attacked in 2009, it seems that would have been absolutely the right decision. If they had attacked in 2009, it would have been much easier than attacking today, right? Later, when Obama signed the Iran nuclear agreement, the entire opportunity to strike Iran was missed. Now, they have no choice but to consider attacking in 2025 or 2026. If this war is fought 15 or 16 years later, it will be much more difficult because Iran's missile capabilities have improved by countless times compared to back then.
Right, exactly. Speaking of Netanyahu domestically, before we get into that, let me ask you something. Back in the 1980s, he already knew Trump. At that time, was his relationship with Trump that of good friends, or were they just acquaintances?
I don't know about that. There's no information available to me on this. What I do know is that back then, he was introduced to several highly influential and important American political figures at that particular time. Trump was definitely on the list of people he met. The two of them definitely met, definitely talked, and definitely established some kind of connection. Trump would have been very clear that the New York Jewish community was bringing him and that guy together for a meeting, laying the groundwork for a future political or economic alliance between the two. In other words, he knew this was not just a casual meeting or a random acquaintance.
True friendship.
Right? But as for what kind of contact or relationship they had afterward, we don't
know. At that time, it just laid the foundation. Now, coming back to Netanyahu and Israel, because I saw you posted on Twitter that back then, no one was optimistic about him, and many people opposed him, but he still succeeded. Then you mentioned, what is his secret? But you didn't write it out below. So now that you're here on the show, can you explain to us what his secret is?
Why was he able to succeed? This secret is actually very important. In 1996, Netanyahu won the Israeli election and defeated Shimon Peres at the time. You have to understand, Shimon Peres held a status in Israel that was like a towering figure. You know, back in 1949, when Israel was founded, Shimon Peres was already the Deputy Minister of Defense. He was the founding father of Israel's atomic bomb project. And for so many years, he had always been one of the most important figures in Israeli politics. And that's not all. When you were just starting your studies in the U.S., you had served as ambassador to the United States, and then you came back and went on to challenge him. Peres' authority was unacceptable. Everyone believed it was impossible. Moreover, at the time, the Middle East peace process was being vigorously promoted by the United States, and global public opinion was being guided. Even within Israel, including myself at the time, there were supporters of the Middle East peace process. However, regardless of who they were, everyone felt that the Middle East peace process was a historical inevitability, Israel giving up territory to reach a peace agreement with the Arabs. This seemed very inappropriate in Nehu's case, because Nehu didn't dare to say say he opposed the Middle East peace process, he only emphasized one point. While pursuing peace, we must ensure the security of the state of Israel. In other words, you can't just have peace and not security. It's just a pretty face. So, Simon Peres won the Nobel Peace Prize for signing the Oslo Accords with the Arabs, and his prestige was at its peak, right? Now, speaking of political lineage, I briefly mentioned Netanyahu's family on Twitter. They, of course, were involved in Judaism very early on. His father was actually an important figure in Judaist politics, but they were severely marginalized because historically, until the 1990s, the mainstream of Judaism was always the left, the Labour Party. The initial formation of the Haganah organization was entirely aligned with left-wing ideologies. Meanwhile, the right-wing element within Zionism was known as the revisionist faction. These revisionists were always a sidelined and marginalized group. They functioned as a very small military organization, were constantly suppressed by others, and possessed virtually no significant political influence or power to speak of. Netanyahu's family, his father was involved in the Zionist revisionist faction. He was part of the right wing, but even within the right, he was marginalized. The reason for this marginalization was that the political leader he followed was Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the founder of the right wing. He was its spiritual leader. Even today, if you look at many Jewish right-wingers on Twitter, they still regard Jabotinsky as their spiritual leader. But Jabotinsky, he was exiled by the British very early on. The British expelled him from Israel, expelled him from Palestine, and wouldn't let him stay there. So he later lived in New York, which meant his influence back home became very limited. So when Netanyahu's father returned to Israel, he actually wanted to enter politics, but he had no real power because neither the left nor the right accepted him anymore. As a result, he ended up having a pretty miserable time in Israel. In the end, he slunk back to the United States and took a university position at Cornell. He always felt disheartened about Israel because he kept failing, and whenever he talked about Israel, it was always with all kinds of criticism. On this point, Netanyahu and his brother Yonatan Netanyahu once corresponded and criticized their father, saying that this kind of defeatist attitude was not right. They felt that no matter what, they still had to return to Israel, that they had to realize our ideals in Israel. So in this regard, they were still different from their fathers. So by 1996, if you think about it, when I went back, you could say that the right timing, the right place, and the right people were all missing for him. So during the general election, to what extent did this go? Basically, everyone thought it was a given that Peres would win, right? So even on the night of the primary election, I remember that night when I went to bed, everyone still thought Peres had won, no problem. If I remember correctly, at that time, Clinton had already sent his congratulations to Peres or something like that, all the congratulations and everything. But then the next morning, suddenly it was announced that the vote count was off, that something was wrong. That day, I was shocked. It was that kind of shock.
Doesn't it feel exactly just like that?
Trump in 2016? Yes, absolutely. What happened with Trump's 2016 election result had actually already happened in Israel in 1996, right? So what's the secret behind this? The secret is that what's really important is that Netanyahu, modern politics defeated traditional politics. Modern electoral politics has defeated traditional electoral politics. Netanyahu used the management theories he learned at MIT. This set of modern political consulting theories, this whole system, there is a very important difference between this theory and traditional politics. What is the main difference with traditional politics? Back then, it was mainly through polling and through media analysis. But that analysis did not yet have the capabilities of today's big data or AI analysis. But, doing this kind of analysis, it was already many times more advanced than traditional politics. That is to say, by using polling and analyzing media trends, they were able to get a clear understanding. At that time, what were the real demands of the public rather than being misled by political propaganda? As for Peres, he followed the traditional political path. Traditional political stakeholders, well, a politician has a certain viewpoint. He has a slogan, he has some ideas, and he just puts them out there and promotes them relentlessly. He hoped that everyone among the public would listen to his views, so he didn't go and, on the contrary, he didn't go to investigate, to do some research to see what the public actually wanted. So this is the biggest difference between the two. At that time, Netanyahu did not follow the traditional party line. Instead, he hired At that specific time, he hired a highly professional polling company to help him conduct extensive research across Israel, in order to figure out exactly what the deep-seated concerns and primary motivations were for the major voter groups in the country. Then these experts helped him meticulously design the entire campaign slogan, the comprehensive political platform, and the overall strategic direction for his run. So, relying on this, he was able to defeat his opponent, Israel's founding father, Shimon Peres. So at that time, this was a shock to the Israeli political scene. Today, this approach has already become the standard political practice. So if you take a look, you can see how sharp Netanyahu's mind is. That is to say, he wouldn't be fooled by appearances.
By them. That kind of...
The mainstream public opinion or mainstream ideas. He's not the kind of person who just follows along. He has his own mind, his own perspective on the world, his own ability and method to judge things. So as for him, many times you feel like he's a lone wolf, just like in this war. In the previous 2 years, during Biden's term, you felt like he was all alone, as if in the whole world. He was the only one who wanted to do things this way. Everyone else was against him, but he has his own way of seeing the world, his own method of judgment. He never believes that the opinion of the majority represents the truth. The opinion of the majority does not necessarily become reality. He firmly believes that in this world, many times, the true opinions of the majority are actually being suppressed. That the silent majority, the things you hear from them may not be the truth. So if you can find out what the real voice is, and you dare to stick to that voice, then in the end, victory will be in your hands. And not with those who just seem to have a lot of supporters. People.
But even if he uses scientific methods to figure out what the public wants, why is it that when he tells the public, I can give you these things, the public actually believes him? He must still have some other unique qualities, right? Otherwise, why would the public believe him? For example, if I want something, say I want economic stability or I want security or something like that. You say you can give me security, you can give me economic stability. So why should I believe you? What kind of qualities does he have that make people
believe him? There isn't really a saying like, I believe him, I don't believe him. His problem is because of the so-called Oslo peace process. From the very beginning, it was extremely bloody, just extremely bloody. You see, I arrived in Israel in August 1993, and in September, that was when the handshake at the White House happened, the Oslo peace. That was me, before I went to Israel, before I arrived in Israel. At first, Israel was quite a peaceful place. There were only a few terrorist activities, just a few incidents of terrorism. Both the scale and the impact of these were very small, right? Yes, it was peaceful competition. From the very beginning, Hamas started launching large-scale terrorist attacks in Israel. At that time, terrorist incidents deteriorated rapidly. The security situation quickly became visibly worse. You could feel in your heart the kind of threat to people's daily lives. So in this situation, you don't need someone to come out and say, you can absolutely trust me on this. I will definitely be able to ensure your complete safety and protect you from any harm that might come your way. But as long as there is someone who is truly willing to step forward and take a stand for what is right and say, if you give me this position, I will put your safety as my top priority. At that point, the public will vote for him. Because overall, he is just a decision maker. Ultimately, when it comes to security, it's the specific departments that handle it. It's the Israel Defense Forces that do it. It's Israel's security agencies that do it. This includes, even today, the Israel Defense Forces among the public. In the minds of the public, their status is extremely, extremely high. The public has great trust in them. So as long as it's about politics, the Israeli public has always had this idea, which is to say, they feel that it's the government that is holding back the Israel Defense Forces from fully utilizing their capabilities for political reasons. So if the defense forces could act without restrictions, then these security issues could be resolved. Even today on Twitter, I still occasionally see Israelis or Jews saying things like this, meaning, just let the defense forces act freely. Why are you restricting them? That's what they're saying. So essentially, there's no need for for those two parties to come up with a very concrete plan and say, we guarantee Israel's security. As long as you say, as Prime Minister, I put security first, that's already enough. That's enough.
So his business rivals can't even identify or recognize this specific strategic point?
Back then, Israeli political discourse had already fallen into this kind of polarized trap. That is to say, you can't talk about this. At the same time, I emphasize security. That is to say, back then, those who supported you only talked about peace. They supported Middle East peace. If you talked about both peace and security, you would become someone who opposed Middle East peace. So his opponents couldn't mention the word security. If you brought up security, if you mention this word, then immediately you'll lose those left-wing votes, right? This is I don't know if this is a characteristic of Israeli politics. For example, during the war, these past 2 years during the war, there was the hostage issue, right? So you could use that as leverage. They came up with slogans, Hebrew slogans, 2 types of slogans. The 2 slogans are very similar. One is bring the hostages home, meaning bring them back. Bring them home is one slogan. The other slogan, they just add one more word on the sign saying bring them home immediately, right? These are actually 2 completely different political factions. The phrase bring them home is used by Israel's centrist or right-wing parties, both of them. It's something they have in common, right? We will bring them home. But if you put up a slogan that says bring them home immediately, that means you're saying stop fighting this war, immediately reconcile with Hamas and agree to all of Hamas's conditions. That way the hostages would be released right away. They would be brought back, right? So back then, when the war broke out and was still ongoing, it should have been in October. At that time, I went on a cruise that was chartered by Yesenland to Antarctica. On that ship, you could really see what it was like back then. On the ship, at the end, everyone took a group photo together. When they stood together for the group photo, there was a slogan behind them that said, bring them home, bring them home. Everyone stood there and took this group photo. Then, among the tourists on the ship, a group of people took out another banner that said, bring them home immediately. As soon as this banner saying, bring them home immediately was unfurled, about half of the Israelis immediately left the scene like, I'm not filming this event. So this is really just a difference of a single word. But this is actually taking a completely different political stance.
All right, I understand. I also saw someone on Twitter who seemed to be an Israeli leftist. He said that although he differs greatly from Bibi on many policy discussions and disagrees in various ways, he said that when it comes to striking Iran, he actually strongly supports him. He said that in his opinion, no one is more suitable than Netanyahu to handle this matter. Because as far as I remember about Netanyahu, it seems that his focus and execution are unmatched. He said that's why nobody's better than Netanyahu for this, finally adding he hopes once this ends, afterwards, you can take care of our import issues. Why is that? Because they also believe Netanyahu is the most suitable person for this task.
Attacking Iran in Israel, there is actually a considerable consensus on this, even more so than the consensus on attacking Hamas, including the start of this war. Previously, Israel's opposition leader Lapid also stated publicly, if we attack Iran, I will set aside all political disputes. Let's first take care of Iran before anything else. So on this point, there is really no issue. If we're talking about attacking Iran and Israel, truly no one is more qualified than Netanyahu to speak on this matter. Netanyahu has been planning to strike Iran since 2009. He has been preparing for so many years. No one else has this kind of foresight. No one else has this much psychological preparation and this kind of, well, you could call it a sense of mental determination, preparation, including, for example, just a couple of days ago when they just bombed and killed that person. There was a photo circulating online of this Razi Jani. It shows that guy making a phone call, giving orders, right? That photo might even be new. It could also be old, but it doesn't matter. Yet what you need to notice is that behind that guy, on the bookshelf, there's an English book titled Ayatollah Decree. So you see, the books he usually throws on his bookshelf, they're all about Iran, about Iranian religion. He studies Iran's leaders and figures very thoroughly, and he also knows a bit about South Asia. After the 12-day war, he went to the Western Wall and made a prayer. So from this, you can see that he considers eliminating Iran, removing Iran as a threat to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people as a kind of biblical level mission. It carries a bit of that sense. Although he himself is not a believer, he doesn't truly practice Judaism, he still has this kind of biblical sense of mission, especially this war. It's connected with the Jewish holiday of Purim. Purim, as recorded in the book of Esther, the Jews remember in history within the Persian Empire, the Prime Minister Haman, who tried to persecute the Jews, was eliminated. It's this kind of legend. He has that sense of mission. I want to save the Jewish people, just like Israel did in the Bible, to protect the nation of Israel, or from the threat of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So when we talk about focus, about this sense of mission, it's precisely this sense of mission that drives him, his own tremendous commitment to this matter. In Israel, there is no one else who can compare to him. No one else even comes close. They're simply not on the same level. So Iran is also unlucky, as is Hamas. If the October 7th massacre had happened 10 years later, or even 5 years later, then Netanyahu might have been too old by then, or maybe he just wouldn't have had the energy to fight this war. But as it happened, Netanyahu was just at the right moment. You could say that his career and experience had reached their peak. So 2 years ago, I once joked on Twitter at the time saying Iran was threatening to launch missiles at Israel. At that time, I posted a tweet about it. I said, for that guy, if you launch missiles at him, that would be exactly what he wants. Like, I've been waiting for you for so many years. So indeed, that's how things have developed over the past 2 years. That guy said, I've caught such an opportunity, and to a large extent, actually, if we look at how things have developed over these 2 years, in fact, it was that guy who, to some extent, lured them in. Iran has step by step fallen into the trap of direct confrontation with Israel. From the very beginning, that guy's intention was never just to fight Hamas. This war was never just about fighting Hamas, but rather step by step luring Iran in. In early 2024, he launched a targeted bombing attack against Iran's then ambassador to Syria. The ambassador. The diplomatic residence was bombed, killing 2 generals. Many people supported this. Friends of Israel all came to me and said, what is he doing? Right? They couldn't understand the moves Israel was making, because at that time, Israel was already overwhelmed fighting Hamas and Hezbollah. Then Biden was causing trouble for Israel, and the entire Western world was making things difficult for Israel. At that time, The Economist published an article in March, I believe. They published a cover story titled Israel Alone and Isolated. Right? That really was the case. And in this situation, if you don't focus on fighting Hamas and don't focus on fighting Hezbollah, and yet you still go and provoke Iran, right? In fact, looking back now, this move was actually Netanyahu's intention at the time. He wanted to use this to drag Iran into the conflict because Iran has always fought through proxies throughout the Middle East. Iran has never directly entered the war or fought you head on. What Netanyahu did was to force Iran to get involved, to force Iran into a direct confrontation with him. If Iran refused to step in, it would lose face in front of all its little brothers, lose prestige and lose respect. Losing your honor is something that is unacceptable in the Islamic world. If you do get involved, then you are no longer fighting me through proxies. It's just you and me. It would be a direct face-to-face confrontation between us. Iran is not the kind of opponent that Israel has prepared for in this way. Iran has always wanted to lead a war against Israel, but in terms of military and technological capabilities, in these areas, Iran is no match for Israel at all. So in a direct confrontation, that day, that guy made a decision to defeat Iran, to beat Iran, so he is dragging Iran into this step by step. But the fatal thing for Iran is that Iran really fell for it. So in April 2024, Iran launched missiles at Israel for the first time. When they fired those missiles, it was the first wave. And at that time, I made a video about it. That video is still available today on my WeChat public account. A couple of days ago, I went back and watched that video myself. I think my judgment at the time was actually quite accurate. Back then, my commentary was that Iran had fallen into a trap, that Iran shouldn't have gotten involved directly, that Iran shouldn't have confronted Israel itself. Through proxy wars, things had actually been going very smoothly. Iran had always been the one benefiting. But if Iran were to get directly involved and fight Israel head-on in a direct war, Iran would definitely lose. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So that was my judgment at the time. Of course, Iran doesn't care what I think. He didn't listen to what I said on my public account either. So he was lured step by step into this trap by that guy. In the end, it turned into a direct war between Iran and Israel. In this war, Iran has absolutely no chance of winning, none at all. That's just how it is. It's impossible.
Hello everyone, today I want to recommend to you the Jeju Island Red Sea Cucumber Repair Gel from Korea, which has sold out multiple times. This is made from wild Red Sea cucumbers handpicked by local Haenyeo divers, not farmed, so it's rich in growth factors. It's very effective for repairing bodily wounds, chronic inflammation, and high blood pressure. It's especially suitable for friends with chronic illnesses or those who need long-term recovery after surgery. Red Sea Cucumber is now offering a subscription service. You can choose 1 box per month or every 2 months. When it's time for your box, it will be sent out automatically, which is very convenient, and you can also enjoy additional discounts. From now until the Lantern Festival, everyone who subscribes to the Red Sea Cucumber will receive an extra box of Red Sea Cucumber as a gift. When making your purchase, remember to use my promo code FANGFEI to enjoy a 15% discount.